Much has been written about the tyrannical reign of King Henry VIII, the iron-fisted ruler who shattered England's ties with Rome, dissolved the monasteries, and left a trail of executed queens and fallen favourites in his wake. His life, marked by political upheaval, religious revolution, and personal scandal, has captivated generations. Yet behind the towering legend lies a lesser-known, grislier tale, one not of power or policy, but of decay, rot, and royal indignity. Few know the agonising ailments that ravaged Henry in his final years, and fewer still have heard the stomach-turning accounts of what happened to his bloated corpse after death. So what became of the most infamous king in English history? How did his body meet its end? And why does a monarch who lived with such magnificence nowadays lie in a forgotten tomb beneath an unremarkable slab, hidden in plain sight? Henry VIII began life in robust health. Aside from a bout of smallpox in 1514 and the occasional recurrence of malaria, likely contracted in the marshy southern counties, he was deemed fit and healthy. In fact, in his prime, Henry was widely admired for both his athleticism and appearance. He was a force of nature at court, famed for his abilities at jousting, hunting skills, and vigour on the tennis court. But this relentless pursuit of sport came at a cost. As early as 1527, Henry began suffering from sports-related injuries. A particular painful injury to his left foot while playing tennis caused such swelling that he began to wear a loose black velvet slipper, soon adopted by sycophantic courtiers. That same year he was confined to Canterbury with what was recorded as a sore leg. This appears to be the first written indication of the leg ulcers that would plague him for the remainder of his life. By 1526, Henry's habits had begun to turn more sedentary and more indulgent. The Ordinances of Eltham, a highly detailed daily account of his dietary requirements, reveal a massive appetite dominated by heavy meats, sugary pastries, and wine. This gluttony had an evident effect. A look at his ever-widening suits of armour is proof enough. By the time he was 44, Henry had become morbidly obese. He reportedly needed assistance to mount a horse, but still continued to participate in the sport when possible. However, in January 1536, a jousting accident at Greenwich would change the course of his health permanently. He was thrown off his horse, and the massive armoured body of his mount came crashing down atop him. Henry lay unconscious for 2 hours. Some historians believe he sustained fractures to the long bones of his legs, while others point to the likelihood of traumatic brain injury. The physical wounds healed, but the ulceration in his legs returned and became chronic. The year 1536 has often been termed his annus horribilis. His jousting injuries, the miscarriage of a male heir by Anne Boleyn, the death of his illegitimate son, the Duke of Richmond, and the scandal surrounding Anne's alleged adultery all contributed to a year of tragedy. His mood darkened. Those around him noticed an increased irritability, a dangerous volatility, and a deepening cruelty. The king, once celebrated for his charm, was becoming feared. Henry's ulcers were now bilateral, purulent, and oozing. He excused himself from travel in a letter to the Duke of Norfolk. "To be frank with you, which you must keep to yourself, a humour has fallen into our legs, and our physicians advise us not to go far, in the heat of the day." His legs were lanced frequently to drain the abscesses and relieve the pressure of built-up fluid. Some sources describe the use of red-hot irons to burn open the wounds and allow the noxious discharge to escape. A French report sent from the English court recorded, "For 10 to 12 days the humours, which had no outlet, were likely to have stifled him, so that he was sometimes without speaking, black in the face, and in great danger." In 1543 he married Catherine Parr, a match some believe was less about love and more about securing a competent nursemaid in his declining years. By then, the odour from his ulcers had become so pronounced that courtiers and servants reported it could be smelt from 3 rooms away. He began using a staff to walk, and in 1542 he was no longer able to ascend the stairs unaided. A primitive lift, little more than a crude hoist heaved up by unenvied servants, enabled the king to ascend floors in Whitehall Palace. By 1545, the once proud rider and hunter had to be moved in a custom-built chair borne by 6 yeomen of the guard. This contraption, known as the King's Tram, became his primary mode of movement. By January 1547, it was evident to everyone around him that Henry was dying. Yet to speak it aloud was to risk a charge of treason. His physicians lacked the courage to tell him directly, so it fell to Sir Anthony Denny, a trusted member of the Privy Council. Denny approached the ailing king and said, "In man's judgment, he was likely not to live, and should remember his sins, as becometh every good Christian man to do." To which Henry, perhaps sensing the truth, replied, "I believe Christ in all his mercy will pardon me all my sins, though they were greater than can be." As death drew near, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer was summoned to Henry's bedside sometime after midnight on the 28th of January. When he arrived, the king was unconscious and unable to speak. Cranmer leaned close and asked Henry if he still placed his trust in Christ to give a sign. The king said nothing, but then suddenly grasped Cranmer's hand with all the strength he could muster. Those present took this as evidence of his final act of faith. Henry VIII died a short time later, likely around 2 a.m. Most modern scholars believed he succumbed to complications from chronic leg infections, heart failure, or renal failure. Thus ended the reign of one of England's most formidable and most physically ruined monarchs. Following the death of King Henry VIII in the early hours of the 28th of January 1547, the task of preserving his earthly remains fell to the royal embalmers. In accordance with custom, they opened up the body and removed the internal organs, replacing them with a mixture of sawdust, resin, and aromatic herbs designed to mask the odour and delay decomposition. Yet even their seasoned hands could not disguise the truth. Too much time had passed. The king's body had already begun to decay. Once embalmed, the corpse was sealed in a heavy lead shell and encased within a wooden coffin. Surrounded by tall tapers burning day and night, the coffin was laid in state within the presence chamber of Whitehall Palace, where courtiers, nobles, and clergy paid their respects beneath the gilded canopy of the estate. Solemn bells tolled from steeples across the realm, calling the kingdom into mourning for the passing of its monarch. When the time came to move the body to Windsor for burial, an extraordinary funeral procession was arranged, one of the grandest ever witnessed in Tudor England. The cortege stretched over 4 miles long. More than 1,000 mourners on horseback rode in solemn formation, accompanied by hundreds of foot. The king's coffin was borne atop a vast gilded chariot, drawn by 8 black-plumed horses. Above it, a life-sized effigy of Henry himself, crowned and robed, lay in regal repose beneath a rich canopy. Yet the journey was not without ominous incident. As the cortege passed overnight at Sion Abbey, a dark tale began to spread. It was said that the king's corpse, already bloated with decay, had burst within the coffin. The lead casing had cracked and fluid had seeped onto the abbey floor. One version of the story even claimed that dogs were seen licking the king's bodily remains. The tale echoed a chilling prophecy once delivered by the Franciscan friar William Peto in 1532, spoken boldly in the presence of Henry VIII and his soon-to-be second wife Anne Boleyn. A loyal ally of Catherine of Aragon, Henry's cast-aside queen, Peto dared to compare the English monarch to the biblical king Ahab, the infamous ruler of Israel in the 9th century BC. According to scripture, Ahab ignored the warnings of the prophet Elijah, ultimately dying in agony from wounds inflicted in battle. His fate was sealed not only by his disobedience but by his marriage to Jezebel, a pagan queen whose influence led to the worship of foreign gods. To Henry's critics, the parallel was striking. Just as Jezebel brought religious upheaval to Israel, so too did Anne Boleyn usher in the English Reformation, a seismic shift in the nation's spiritual life. Peto warned the king with astonishing boldness. Unless he repented, dogs would lick his blood, just as they lapped up Ahab's. The prophecy was met with fury, Peter was imprisoned and later exiled, yet for some, the friar's grim vision was vindicated 15 years later at Sion Abbey. That the incident occurred at Sion Abbey only added to the symbolism. Henry had ordered the abbey dissolved and its lands seized. Now his leaking body rested in a place he had once desecrated. Despite the many striking parallels, whether the oozing remains of the king's corpse were truly lapped up by dogs remained shrouded in uncertainty. The tale first appears in print in the 17th century in The History of the Reformation of the Church of England by Gilbert Burnet, later Bishop of Salisbury. Burnet, a Protestant theologian with a clear religious agenda, has been accused of embellishment. Even so, the story captured the imagination of later generations and has since become embedded in Tudor folklore. Regardless of whether the coffin split or the dogs licked Henry's blood, the procession resumed to its course the following morning. On the 16th of February 1547, Henry VIII was laid to rest in St George's Chapel, Windsor Castle. His remains were interred in the same vault as his third wife, Jane Seymour, the woman that he'd called his true love and the mother of his long-desired heir, Edward VI, now King of England. For a man so obsessed with grandeur, legacy and divine right, the simplicity of his burial is almost unthinkable. In truth, this was only intended as a temporary resting place for the former king. During the 17th century, the antiquarian John Speed unearthed a manuscript, now lost, which offered detailed insight into the original plans for Henry's tomb. The design dated back to 1527, when Henry was still in full bloom of youth and power. Inspired by the Renaissance splendour of Italian funerary art, the tomb was conceived as a grand edifice, fashioned from rare oriental stones and white marble, adorned with gilded bronze angels, life-sized effigies of Henry and Queen Jane Seymour, and crowned by a magnificent equestrian statue of the king himself, raised beneath a triumphal arch. No expense was to be spared, the manuscript recorded. There shall be 4 images of the king and queen of the whole stature, and one of the king on horseback under an arch, of the whole stature of a godly man and a large horse. In total, 134 bronze gilt figures were to be embellished on the structure, including depictions of the apostles, the evangelists, the prophets, and patron saints like St George and St John the Baptist. Henry, ever concerned with posterity, began the preparations during his lifetime. Following the downfall of Cardinal Wolsey, he seized the cardinal's own splendid black marble sarcophagus, repurposing it as a base for his intended tomb. An effigy of the king was reported cast and polished before his death in 1547. Some work continued sporadically under each of his children, Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I, but the project was never completed. By the time of the English Civil War, the bronze effigy was sold by the order of the Commonwealth government to raise funds in 1646. The tomb's physical remnants suffered an even more ignoble fate. In 1808, the great black sarcophagus, once meant to cradle Henry's mortal remains, was transported to the crypt of St Paul's Cathedral, where it became the base of Admiral Lord Nelson's monument. Thus, the most ambitious royal tomb in English history became a pedestal for Britain's naval hero. The vault at Windsor has been disturbed several times over the centuries. In the 17th century, it was opened to inter the body of the executed King Charles I beside Henry and Jane. It was reopened again in the 18th century to admit an infant of Queen Anne's, and once more in 1888 during works on a new royal passageway. During this final disturbance, A.Y. Nutt, then surveyor of the fabric to the St George's Chapel, created a watercolour rendering of the royal vault. He found Henry's coffin in a poor state. The outer wooden casing had long since collapsed into fragments, and the inner lead coffin bore the appearance of having been beaten in with violence about the middle. In fact, the damage was so severe that Henry's skeletal remains were partially visible, including his skull, still bearing traces of beard. It's been claimed, though never definitely proven, that the coffin burst from within due to gases produced by decomposition. It's equally possible that the damage to Henry's coffin was the result of time, shifting stones, or careless movement during earlier intrusions into the vault. Notably, Jane Seymour's lead coffin placed beside Henry's was found to be in perfect condition. Henry VIII's reign was marked by tyranny, bloodshed, and a relentless pursuit of power. In the end, his body, once a symbol of immense authority, met a gruesome end, decaying and leaking fluids in his coffin. It's almost as if his physical deterioration mirrored the brutal legacy he left behind, a reminder that even the mightiest rulers eventually face the consequences of their cruelty.